what is religion? Who is God? How does he interact with us? You know, a lot of times we think that religion and our understanding of God, those are the two things that are primarily at play when we think of religion. You know, it's who God is and what he's done for us, and that is the totality of religion. And religious people are people that ascribe to some sort of faith practice. You know, they go to a house of worship and they pray on a regular basis. But one of the things that I've learned, especially in the last several months, is that we are all inherently religious people. And I was reading a book for one of my classes in my doctorate of ministry by David Dark. And David Dark wrote a book called Life's Too Short to Pretend You're Not Religious. And this is what he had to say about religion. One of the things he had to say about religion as an entity or as a guiding practice. This is what he says. He says, religion happens when we get pulled in, moved, called out, or compelled by something outside ourselves. He says later on that same page, religion is certainly often an opiate for the masses, but it can also function as the poetry of the people. Whether we spy it in ritual or symbol or ceremony, religion isn't something one can be coherently for or against or decide to somehow suddenly engage because it's already there. See, what David Dark is saying is that we are all religious people. We all engage on some level with a God or some sort of divine guiding sort of practice. Whether we call it divine or not, it's something that compels us, and it draws us in, and it moves us. You know, I was thinking about that, and I started thinking about what are the things that compel me. I'm a pastor. I'm an associate pastor here at the First Presbyterian Church in Lakeland. And I've been compelled by a lot of things that most people wouldn't call religious. In fact, I'm sitting here in my office surrounded by artifacts of some of that religion that's outside the spiritual. I mean, behind me you can actually see I've got, the Gryffindor symbol, from Harry Potter, and one of the little minifigures from Harry Potter. That happens to be Sirius Black. And over on my desk I've got the space shuttle, which when I was a kid it captured my imagination. I've got an SR-71 Blackbird model. Because when I was a kid, that being that fast airplane, it captured my imagination. David Dark goes on to talk about some of the things that shape us religiously, and he has this term that he calls our attention collection. This is what he says on page 45 of Life's Too Short to Pretend You're Not Religious. He says, we are, each of us, libraries full of experience, sensations, words spoken for and against us, memories of joy and trauma, inexplicable scenes and unresolved stories. These are libraries that either have happened directly to us or we've experienced in the cultural world through books or movies or music. And some of those things shape us far more than what we consider typical religious experience. And one of those artists that has shaped my life and shaped my understanding of the world and how it works and my understanding of God is the artist Sufjan Stevens. Sufjan Stevens is primarily thought of as a musician, but he's much more than that. He's a visual artist, a filmmaker, photographer, he's done all sorts of work. And Sufjan, for those that aren't familiar with his work, I kind of became familiar with his work about 13 years ago when I heard that this crazy folk artist was going to take on a project to do a concept album for every state in the United States. I thought that is just crazy, and this is a guy I've got to pay attention to. I come to find out that Sufjan is actually a self-professed Christian. He's a believer. But he doesn't use his faith as sort of a rallying cry evangelistically, but just as a filter or the lens through which he experiences all of his life. And, I realized how deep his faith was after his first state's record called Michigan, which I'll talk about in another video. But he put an album out called Seven Swans, and Seven Swans is probably his most overtly faith-based album. I mean, it talks about his own spiritual journey. He uses the narratives from the Bible. But as I've followed the course of Sufjan Stevens' life, his work, I noticed something really compelling about Sufjan Stevens that I've found missing in most modern churches. He has a very balanced view of God as transcendent over us, but also deeply and personally related to us. You know, I went to Reformed Theological Seminary, and one of my professors was a great Reformed systematic theologian, John Frame. And John Frame, in his book, The Doctrine of the Knowledge of God, talks about transcendence and immanence. He says this in his book, The Doctrine of the Knowledge of God. He says, historically, terrible problems have developed with concepts of transcendence and immanence. The transcendence of God, that is his exaltation and his mysteriousness, has been understood as God's being infinitely removed from the creation, being so far from us, so different from us, so wholly other and wholly hidden that we can have no knowledge of him and make no true statements about him. And he talks about immanence in the same way. He says, similarly, the concept of immanence has been distorted in non-Christian thought and even in some would-be Christian theologies. Immanence has been understood to mean that God is virtually indistinguishable from the world, that when God enters the world, he becomes so worldly that he really can't be found. I think this is a terrible tragedy to have this imbalance when really God is transcendent. He is glorious. He is kind of unimaginable. But at the same time, because he is covenant in covenant relationship with people, he has revealed himself to his people. And when I listen to and engage with the art of Sufjan Stevens, I see that balance. And so over the course of the next several videos, I'm going to talk about that balance and talk about how Sufjan Stevens specifically helps me understand that balance and helps direct or at least guide my thoughts in reading Scripture. Now, I know some people would say that's a dangerous way to do exegesis, but I also think a lot of times we can learn so much about God from outside traditional spiritual or religious arenas. One of the authors of a book I read for my doctorate of ministry, Robert K. Johnston, he wrote a book called God's Wider Presence, and he said this in his book. He says, rather than reflecting on our personal experience with the transcendence, we have too often settled for intellectual conviction based on detached philosophical arguments. You know, a lot of times in my spiritual journey, I've kind of rested on or settled for the philosophical being the only way to think about God. And yet I believe God has been revealing himself not just to me, but to all people in a variety of different ways, in a variety of different forms. Now I want you to take a listen for a moment to one of Sufjan Stevens' songs, On Seven Swans, which again is a very faith-based album. But I want you to listen to how he unpacks the Abraham sacrifice of Isaac's story, and then we'll talk about it for just a moment.
Worth a righteous one, take a pound of wood, put it on your son. Lake or land, none to harm. When the angel came, you had raised your arm. Put off on your son, take instead the ram until Jesus comes.
You know, for Sufjan Stevens, the story of Abraham's near sacrifice of Isaac in Genesis 22 is part of his attention collection, as David Dark would put it. And in 2 short stanzas, the climax of Abraham's faith journey is put on display in a very delicate way. And at the same time, Stevens points forward typologically to the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. This is a part of Sufjan's faith journey. But it's just as much a part of his faith journey as some of the relationships that he has. And he talks about in Seven Swans, songs like That Dress Looks Good on You, or Sister, or Size Too Small. Those are all part of Sufjan's faith journey as much as the story of Abraham. He also sings about his own personal experience with Jesus Christ. And I want you to take a listen to this song called To Be Alone With You. It's probably the most well-known song on the Seven Swans album.
I swim across Lake Michigan. I sell my shoes. I'd give my body to be back again in the rest of the room, to be alone with you, to be alone with you, to be alone with you, to be alone with you.
Stevens talks about the depth and the importance of Jesus' sacrifice in his own life. If you didn't catch it, here's some of the words that he's saying. He says, "You gave your body to the lonely. They took your clothes. You gave up a wife and a family. You gave your ghost to be alone with me." And he sings that, to be alone with me, to be alone with me. You went up on a tree to be alone with me. You went up on a tree. I've never known a man who loved me. And then Stevens talks about his own response to that, to be alone with Jesus in this life. You know, thinking about faith using a pop cultural artist or musician, thinking about God's transcendence and immanence using a form that's not necessarily sacred but secular, even from a self-professed Christian, may seem very odd, but it's actually very much in keeping with how the Scripture talks about communicating to us. I want you to look for a second at Acts chapter 17. In Acts chapter 17, we'll get the image of Paul, who is on one of his missionary journeys, and he finds himself in Athens. And this is what it says in Acts chapter 17, verse 16, starting with verse 16. It says, "Now while Paul was waiting for them at Athens, his spirit was provoked within him as he saw that the city was full of idols." So Paul is walking around Athens, and he sees all these religious artifacts, not from his own faith, but from the pagan life of the people there. And so first it says he goes according to pattern, and he goes to the synagogue and he talks to the Jewish people and the devout persons in the marketplace every day with those who happen to be there. And some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers also conversed with him. And some said, "What does this babbler wish to say?" Others says he seems to be a preacher of foreign divinities because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection. And they took him and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, "May we know what this new teaching is that you're presenting, for you bring some strange things to our ears. We wish to know, therefore, what these things mean." Now all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there would spend their time in nothing except telling or hearing something new. So they were very interested in hearing what Paul had to say, because it seemed like new teaching. It was kind of like having the latest iPhone or the latest bit of technology that some people have. I'm kind of one of those people. They wanted the latest knowledge or the latest new idea. And so Paul, you got to think, Paul has just been reasoning with people in the synagogue and in the marketplace, and now he's talking to Epicureans and Stoics and adherents to all these different philosophies. And he uses an entirely different strategy than he uses any place else in his missionary journeys, according to the Scripture. He says, "So Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, said, 'Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious.'" Now notice what he says there. Just exactly what David Dark would say is that these people, though pagans, are still very religious. He says, "For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, 'To the unknown God.' What therefore you worship as an unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. Yet he's not actually far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. And as even some of your own prophets have said, for we are indeed his offspring. Being then God's offspring, we ought not to think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of man. Now it's interesting because Paul, who is a Jew, has worshipped God in a temple, and yet he says God does not dwell in a temple. Why? Because when he looks at the temples of the Athenians, he sees that they're trying to worship these gods who they believe dwell in this temple. It's not just a representation, but that they believe God's actually there. So Paul points to their own artistry. And then he uses, if you look at your own Bibles and you see footnotes, actually quotes different philosophers and poets from the Greek tradition. He doesn't quote the Old Testament. He doesn't quote the Psalms. He quotes the artistry of their tradition. See, when Sufjan Stevens writes Seven Swans, he's taking from his attention collection his own faith journey, thinking about Abraham and how he has experienced salvation and conversion experience with Jesus Christ. But later on, we're going to see that Sufjan pulls from contemplations about the planets, a schizophrenic, self-proclaimed prophet from New Orleans. We're going to see Sufjan pull from all these different places, and ultimately, I think we can learn a lot about the transcendence of God and His immanent activity if we really dig deep into these subjects. That's where we're headed over the next several videos, and I hope you'll join me for those. We're going to be listening to some cool music and also seeing some really interesting and thought-provoking art along the way. And I think and I hope and I pray that in the middle of it, we'll understand better who God is and how He engages in our lives. I hope you'll join me.